Most activities undertaken in procurement tend to be value-driven. Supplier identification and selections are cooperation tasks that a procurement department will undertake in their daily tasks. It's one of those things that you do on your day-to-day activities. The question then is, how do you identify, select, and assess suppliers in private sectors, and how do you do it in public sectors? Or is the process the same in both cases? Let's start by understanding the difference between those two. When I talk about public sectors, but with public sectors, we're talking about organizations that are actually service-based, basically the things that are owned by the government. So anytime you go to any governmental office or any governmental organization, they're not talking about public sector in that case, The people who deal in taxes, where you go to get your driving license, birth certificate, and things of that nature. With private sectors, they're not talking about companies, all the companies that you can think of, Google, Facebook, Amazon. The point is, whenever individuals start companies, then those ones are going to fall under private sectors. Don't confuse private sectors with private or public limited companies. That is just something different, Now, moving on. At this point, I just want to quickly point out that if you are struggling with, the whole procurement cycle thing, I'm going to put a link in the video description that will help you to understand the entire procurement cycle, because in order for you to assess, to select, to identify suppliers, you must have started from somewhere, identifying your business needs and all that stuff until you get to the part where now you're looking for suppliers. That is going to be linked in the video description, because in order for you to get to this part, again, as I said, you need to understand what your business needs, conduct a proper market review, and develop strategy you intend to use. And by the way, if you're also serious about procurement or business agreements, I have a series of lessons on commercial contracting that will be important to you, or that will help you to understand more about business agreements with suppliers or business agreements with pretty much the buyer, depending on which role you're playing in that context. So, link is also going to be in the description, Okay, now let's move on. Let's start with supplier identification in private sectors. Now, as a buyer, there are a number of sources, There are a number of sources that you can use to identify your supplier. We're talking about things like, you can find out what the user department knows, the people in that organization or the people in organizations are likely to be having someone or some firm or some organization in mind. You can start by finding that one out. Number two, you can look at suppliers you've used in the past. You can search on the internet. You can advertise the requirements. You can use vendor engagements. So the point here is just that, you're just trying to figure out a list of suppliers that you're going to work with. That's pretty much what you're doing. You're coming up with a list, and that list is supposed to indicate suppliers that you're willing to work with. So that means you're going to have a number of questions in mind that you need to find answers to. You're talking about things like, how many suppliers in the marketplace are able to provide the product or service? Is this a single or sole source situation? What is the relative buyer and supplier power in the marketplace? That is very important, because that will actually form part of the bargaining mix. If there are many suppliers in the market and there are few buyers, then that actually means that the buyers are powerful, right? Because the supplier, the supplier supply is high, which means, and if there are many buyers in the market and there are few suppliers, the suppliers sort of tend to enjoy some sort of monopolistic competition because there are few. So that's something you need to understand, What's the number? Something else, how might the suppliers in the marketplace view the buyer? And do all suppliers have the same view? Also, how will the makeup of the market affect the selection process? You see, in private sector, you're free to invite as many suppliers as you want to participate in the supplier selection process. The supplier identification may also be a time when a benchmarking exercise is undertaken. I suppose the question at this point is, what exactly do you mean by benchmarking? Benchmarking involves comparing an element of one business, such as price, quality, or service, against another. That's important, That is important. You always want to do that. Of course, you can also run at a risk where suppliers just think, this guy is not even going to choose us. It's just using this data that you're sending to benchmark. You have to be wise about these things. What about public sector, How do you identify suppliers in the public sector? The thing about public sectors is that the identification process is supposed to be way more transparent, way more transparent than in in private sectors. The reason is simple. You see, when you talk about public sectors, you're dealing with citizens' money in the form of tax. And that means there's supposed to be a lot of audit. There's supposed to be a lot of accountability. There's the question of how exactly did you arrive at that supplier that you ended up choosing. In European Union, for instance, public sector buyers will be required to advertise the requirement in the official journal of European Union. Obviously, the rules are going to vary from one country to another. So the question is just, what exactly does your Procurement Act, okay, whatever rules that govern procurement in your country, okay? Like, some countries have public procurement oversight. The point is, there's always some rules that govern how the government institutions are supposed to do, or public sector institutions are supposed to do their procurement. You need to know what are the rules surrounding that before you just jump into telling your friend, hey, we need a website, and you guy has you have a website, rather an IT company, come fix it. Yeah, you need to know what are the rules regarding procurement in public sectors in your country. Okay. Once the potential suppliers in the marketplace have been identified, then you will move on to the supplier assessment and selection process. This is going to involve things like developing request for information, document, and criteria. The thing you have to remember at this point is that you are not choosing the suppliers that you're going to work with. You are developing a list, first of all, okay? You're developing a list, and from that list, you will go through so right now you're just identifying suppliers. Then you're going to go through the selection criteria and all that stuff so that you finally arrive at the one that you're going to work with. And so if that number is big enough, depending on how much time you have, then it's better. So something like a request for information just means you are putting out, it's like a request telling them that we need more information about you, and the nature of that information will vary. In fact, we'll look at that later in the video. The point is, you can start with that, okay? Sending out or putting out a request for information. And then evaluating suppliers against this criteria, in the sense that only suppliers that meet the buyer's minimum requirement will be shortlisted and will progress to the next stage. And usually the next stage in this case could be something like request for proposal. Okay? So that is, okay, these are just the steps that you're likely to do. You started with requesting for information, and then you shortlist the suppliers. And then of these suppliers that you've shortlisted, the question then becomes, okay, here's a problem that we have. Can you send us a proposal showing how you intend to fix that problem? Of course, there are criteria you're going to look at, okay? Like price versus quality and things of that nature. We'll look at those ones later. But the point is, after you have a list, so now these are the ones that you've shortlisted, and let's see the solution that you're likely to provide. Now, number 3, something else that you're likely to do in this process is evaluating tenders. So the thing you have to remember here is that as you're doing all this, you just have to remember that public sector procurement, in fact, it's not just public sector procurement, you just have to remember that whatever you're dealing with, the requirements might vary. So it's always important to understand what was the need from the beginning, okay? That is the reason why you need to understand the entire procurement cycle, okay? So it's not just we are evaluating supply. It's like before you even thought of suppliers, what was the actual problem that you're dealing with? Okay, so now let's look at the assessment stage, prequalification, and selection of suppliers in private sector. In private sector, the way you go about assessing and selecting suppliers is actually going to be governed by internal policies of the organization. Meaning what? It could be the case that in all contracts worth $10,000 and above, you are required to obtain 3 quotes or tenders from potential suppliers. You could also be required to perform a risk assessment, okay? And this could be looking at things like financial, commercial, health, and safety. Now, the other approach, the other thing that you might actually end up thinking about in private sector here could be whether or not you should go with competitive bidding or not. In public sectors, that may not really be a choice, because most of the time in public sector, they just want you to go with competitive bidding, okay? So again, a few minutes we're going to look at that. So the question of competitive bidding, okay? When should you use competitive bidding? And that will depend on things like when the item or service is of sufficient value, when there is a clear specification so that the competitive bids can be evaluated side by side, when competition exists between a number of good quality suppliers, also when there is enough time for the process to be completed properly. But when is it not a good idea to use competitive bidding? In this case, we're talking about when it is not possible to obtain firm prices, okay? I mean, if you really can't, get the actual number, then it means you're going to have to negotiate to know the number. Okay, in cases where the price is fixed, then it's easier to do competitive bidding because it's just a question of saying how much are you guys selling it for and how much are you guys selling it for, and then you compare the prices. Next, when the specification is likely to change, when price is not the main driver, as well as when setup cost and time is prohibitive. So request for information is one of the methods that is commonly used when talking about supplier assessment in private sector. The aim of this process is to create a short list of suppliers that will be invited to the next stage of the procurement. And as we pointed out earlier, usually the next stage can be something like a request for proposal. Okay? Well, it could also just be tender, okay, expression of interest. But let's say you request for information, you shortlist the clients, then the suppliers, then you want to know who's going to fix your problem. Okay, so you can use an RFP for that purpose. Of course, alternatively, as I said, you can use an expression of interest, which means in this case, you're going with tenders. The question then is, what supplier information will you be looking for when you're doing all these requests for information? Now, then for the information you'll be looking at will include things like the companies or persons the supplier has worked with before, the financial information of the supplier. Again, that is important. Why? Because you see, you don't want to award a contract to a company that is going to go bankrupt in like 2 weeks or whatever it is, because that is just going to set you back. You could also look at number 3, insurance level, okay? Certificates such as those relating to ISO accreditation, supplier acceptance of the buyer's standard terms and contractual terms and conditions. This way, you're going to be avoiding something like the battle of the forms, okay? Why? Because, when you're doing procurement, okay, or rather whenever you're getting into any sort of contract, usually in procurement, supplier has their terms and you also have your terms. And so the question can be, whose terms are we using? And the answer can be, or will be something like, who sent their terms last and who accepted those terms? Because if the supplier sent a delivery note with their terms and you accept that, then it means you're doing business on those terms. So by ensuring that they actually accept your terms and conditions, you're avoiding that altogether. And finally, minimum levels of health and safety standards. Once you have that information, then you can apply the pass or fail criteria. For instance, a supplier that doesn't have, say, certain accreditations, like the ISO accreditations, depending on whatever it is that you want, you might just put those ones out. It's like, well, you didn't pass, so you failed. And then you move on to the other supplier. Supplier assessment, prequalification, and selection in public sector is not going to be, again, as simple as what we've just mentioned, because as we pointed out earlier, there's a lot of regulations going on when it comes to public sector procurement. The regulations will mostly focus on things like transparency in the process of procurement, equality of treatment of suppliers, rules against discrimination, rules based on value of the contract. Key procedure to use to assess, prequalify, and select suppliers in public sector is the restricted tender process. Now, there are 2 parts to this. Okay, number 1, the use of an initial prequalification questionnaires, that is PPQ, to create a short list of suppliers. And then number 2, the shortlisted suppliers are then moved to the invitation to tender stage. It is also important for you to notice that not all tenders that you're going to do are going to use that process. Not all tenders will call for the prequalification questionnaires and then invitation to tenders, but most of them will probably just be within that. If you're going with those rules that they put up, like trying to show this process was fair and we took everything into account, then that's one of the methods that you can use. So now let's talk about selection and contract awarding criteria. So after going through the whole, prequalification, selection, and all that process, the RFI, the RFPs, and all that, you still have to now decide which supplier are you going to award that contract to. Because it just comes down to that anyway. All that process was just to get you to a point where now you're like, here's a list of suppliers that we have through, whether it was the request for information, and then after that we told them to give us a proposal, and then after that we looked at the proposal. Okay, or we did a pre-qualification questionnaire, we got list of candidates, we shortlisted these candidates, we send them an expression of interest, they supplied their tender, whatever. You still have now to come down to the, okay, so who are you going to work with? Selection and awarding criteria should be carefully considered alongside the development of the specifications. Why is that important? Think of it this way. You see, there are two things. There is what you want, the specifications, and then there is the criteria you're going to use to measure if those things are achieved, the KPIs, right? And all these things have to become part and parcel of the all selection of a client or rather of a supplier. Because what if you just look at how much it costs them to do that thing for you, and you realize they are economically viable, good, so they're not charging you more, except they actually can't do whatever it is that you hire them to do. So how about that? They could be looking good on paper, but in practice they are way out there. That is the reason why you need to first of all think, what do we even want? What are our specifications in relation to what these people are proposing and how much they are charging us? Very important. Again, look, if you want to learn more about commercial contracts, okay, just check out the link provided in the video description. It will take you to one of my series of videos, okay, courses on commercial contracting in procurement. And of the many things that you're going to study there, we are talking about contract formation, developing specifications and KPIs, the tendering process, things to do with documents that are used in contracts, if you're a supplier or if you're a buyer. The point is, there are a lot of stuff that you're going to study there, and the link is provided in the video description. Anyway, as a buyer, you will need to select award criteria that will ensure that the winning bidder provides the best value for money for the stakeholders' needs. And as always, let's start with selection and awarding criteria in private sector. In private sector, your decision at this point will depend on the following. Detailed information on how the supplier will produce the products or deliver the services, which is why we used RFP, okay, request for proposal. What was the purpose of that? The whole point was to say, look, that's a problem. Propose how you're going to solve it. So that's number one. Number two, risk assessment. And number three, full pricing information. Remember, price is just more than the number they are quoting. There is the price and then there is the cost. So you need to understand all that. And so the point is that as you're awarding this, you're going to look at, again, price. They're also going to look at quality. So it's not just price. It's how much they're charging and what exactly the output will or should look like. When buying routine and transactional items such as stationery, price will have a bigger weighing than quality. But when buying services that will impact people directly, such as an adult social care, quality of the service will matter more than the price. Okay, so let's quickly look at selection and awarding criteria in public sector. Public sectors, by now okay, public sectors, it's not just easy. The reason why we have all these rules in public sectors is because you're trying to avoid things like corruption and all that. And because, again, you're dealing with the public money. You see, in private sector, if you add a contract to the wrong person, then it's just the shareholders and you, okay? So the shareholders are going to be mad at you, or your boss is just going to fire you. And usually that's just it. But with public sector procurement, then we are going to have all these anti-corruption, whatever. The point is, there's a lot at stake there, okay? There is a lot at stake. So with public sector, you're going to use the following. Number one, open tender process. This will begin with an invitation to tender, but what makes it open is that the suppliers are equally, okay, all the suppliers who think they can do that job are equally invited to apply, okay, to apply or to submit their tender bids. This process will be used in cases where there are fewer suppliers in the marketplace, so shortlisting is not required, and the requirement is well developed. You also have to remember that at this stage, okay, with open tender, you're not really using the pre-qualification questionnaires, so it's not there. Number two, restricted tender process. In this case, the assumption you're making that, first of all, you use the pre-qualification questionnaires to shortlist your suppliers, okay? And then that shortlisted, once you have that shortlisted list, those are the people that you invited to submit their tender bids. And number three, we have competitive procedure with negotiation. You shortlist the suppliers and then you ask them to submit their tenders, like round one, and then you negotiate, okay, based on whatever they've submitted. And then there is a final submission of tender, in this case, no more negotiation, right? So that's the thing. There's a series of tender submission, and then the final one, there is no negotiation. And the other one that you can use is competitive dialogue. This is, there are cases where you're dealing with projects where the conditions and the specifications are going to be constantly changing. So it's going to be serious. Of course, you'll start with, as always, pre-qualifying your suppliers. But then, once they submit the tender, you're going to negotiate, and then you'll keep on negotiating. You could even negotiate after the final tender has been submitted. But of course, there are rules, okay? You have to do this in such a way that you don't make, the other suppliers, okay? You don't put the other suppliers at a disadvantage. This is where something like post-tendering negotiation can come in. So you could negotiate, you could use, open tenders, you could use restricted tenders. The point is, all these are choices that are available to you when you're selecting suppliers in public sector procurement. So if there is any question at this point, do let me know. Okay, make sure that you leave it in the comment section. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next lesson.